Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. Our goal in this series is to provide parish staff, volunteers, and diocesan ministers the formation, training, and tools needed to create vibrant Catholic parishes and growing ministries. In today's webinar, Ann Garrido will discuss how the Catholic tradition talks about truth. My name is Erin Pierce. I am the Parish and Curriculum Marketing Specialist at Ave Maria Press. Before we begin our webinar, we would like to recognize our webinar partners, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association of Catholic Family Life Ministers, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the Catholic Campus Ministry Association. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you're able to ask questions. Questions may be sent to our presenter using the question section of the GoToWebinar panel, which you can see here, and I'll ask as many of those as possible at the end of the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be sent to you later this week via email. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Ann M. Garrido is Associate Professor of Homiletics at Aquinas Institute of Theology in St. Louis, Missouri. While her first passion is teaching, for more than 15 years, she has found herself increasingly drawn to administrative roles. Garrido has served as Senior Editor of Human Development magazine and is the author of 5 books, including the award-winning Redeeming Administration. She travels nationally and internationally doing conflict education and mediation work in both business and church worlds. Ann, thank you so much for being with us today.
Erin, thanks for having me.
No problem. I'm going to go ahead and make you the presenter.
Super.
And you can take over.
Wow. Looks good.
There you go.
Super. Well, I just want to thank all of you for coming and being part of a conversation about truth this afternoon. I know that sometimes talking about truth nowadays sounds about as attractive as sticking your hand into a vat of boiling oil. Who wants to do that? You know, when you start talking about truth, you so quickly get labeled as being either political or irrelevant or inflammatory or old-fashioned, out of touch. And it's just as if the word itself evokes a whole lot of feeling within us right now. I imagine for many of you, you could say over the past couple of years, you know, you could think of a conversation that you've been in which truth was at stake, that was a conversation that got you hot under the collar in some way, maybe not even the past 2 years, maybe just the past 2 hours, you could think about that. And you know, in some ways, possibly that's how it is supposed to be. There's ancient, let's see here, minimize me. There we go. There's ancient Jewish midrash that I've loved for a while now, that the story goes that when God was very first creating human beings, as we read about in Genesis 2, that the word that God spoke when breathing into Adam, the very first human being, the word that woke Adam up was the Hebrew word emet, or the Hebrew word for truth. That truth is a word that from the very beginning of creation is something that's got our heart pumping and our blood circulating, and it puts fire in our bones. We could definitely say that that was the case for Jesus. The word appears in the Gospels 19 times, almost always in the Gospel of John. And the Greek word, which is recorded in the Gospel, is aletheia. And even though it mostly appears in John, it also appears in the Gospel of Luke, where it says that even Jesus's naysayers saw him as someone who cared a whole lot about the topic of truth. In addition to these very explicit 19 mentions, Jesus seems to have had a very, we could say, a quirky speech pattern in which he talks in a way that no one else in literature is recorded as talking. In that over and over again, Jesus begins sentences by saying, "Amen, I say to you," or "Amen, amen, I say to you." And amen is a Hebrew word that's very difficult to translate into English, but it is closely related to this word emet. And it's like when it does get translated into English, sometimes it'll be said, truly I say to you, or truly, truly I say to you. But what's interesting is that when Jesus uses this word truth, he uses it in quite a different way than we seem to use the word in contemporary English now. He doesn't talk about it so much as something that he has, but something that he is, or at one point says something that he testifies to, as if it's larger than himself, something that we belong to, or something that we worship in. In one of my very favorite passages, Jesus talks with Nicodemus about truth almost as if it was a verb. He says, but whoever lives the truth comes to the light. And some translations would change that to whoever does the truth or whoever practices truth. And I would say this is sort of an odd phrasing, not the way we usually would use the word. In my head, it's sort of like if someone said, live the bicycle, it would be another way of talking about bicycling. So in Jesus's language, truth is not so much a noun as it is a verb. It's like he's inviting us to truth or to be involved in truthing, a different way of speaking than we usually do. And when I read these passages, especially that last one from John 3, it puts in my mind a question that maybe I hadn't really asked earlier in life before about at this time in history when truth gets us so passionate, gets us all fired up, and we have such strong feelings about truth. What does it really mean to do truthing right? Or another way of saying it, maybe in more formal language, what does it look like for truth to be a way of life? What does truth look like rightly constructed? What would a spirituality of truth look like? Oftentimes we'll hear a definition of theology given, that classic definition of theology, as theology is faith-seeking understanding of. And when I talk about spirituality, what I'm thinking about is, what is faith-seeking a way to live? So if I'm talking about a spirituality of truth, I'm talking about what is faith seeking a way of living truth in our daily life. And what I want to do in this hour is to parse out 4 ways that we tend to use that word truth in our daily speech, and look at what Catholic tradition has to say to each of these 4 different areas, because each one of them has something to say about getting truth right during this era of living in what sometimes is referred to as a post-truth world. We can come back to that term a little bit later. So the first way that I want to talk about truth is truth as a way of trying to see reality as accurately as possible. This is the way of truth that maybe is most familiar to you if you've ever studied philosophy or studied science or theology before. This is the classical definition of truth that's posed by St. Thomas Aquinas, based on the earlier thinking of the philosopher Aristotle, when he says, veritas est adequatio re et intellectus. Literally translated, truth is the adequation of thing and intellect. And you might be like, what does that mean? More simply put, truth means having a mental picture in your head that's aligned with reality. So you don't want to be seeing things that aren't really there. And you do want to be able to see things that are there and to see them as they actually are. So as adequately as possible. In contrast to some Eastern spiritual traditions, Catholicism starts with the premise that there is such a thing as truth. The world is not something that just exists in our mind. It exists on its own, whether we are aware of it or not, whether we believe in it or not. So, for example, the climate is warming or it is not warming, but the existence of global warming is not changed by whether or not you agree that it is warming. Or we could also say, God exists or God does not exist, but God's existence does not depend on you believing in God. So what we could say, though, is that beliefs do have an impact on one's life. You might not believe in gravity, but if you step out of a fourth-story window, you are just as likely to fall and hit the ground just as quickly as the person who does believe in gravity. So in your mind, if things are other than how they actually really are, you're going to run into all kinds of problems in life. There's a famous story, probably of urban legend, that I think captures really well the Catholic perspective on this matter. And it's a dialogue that takes place off the foggy coast of Newfoundland between the US Navy and Canadian authorities. And it goes like this. The Americans say, please divert your course 10 degrees to the north. And the Canadians respond, recommend you divert your course 10 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. Americans respond, hey, this is the captain of a US Navy ship. I again say, divert your degrees 10 degrees to the north. Canadians, no, I say divert your course immediately. Americans, this is the US aircraft carrier, the USS Missouri, second largest ship in the US Atlantic Fleet. We are accompanied by 3 destroyers, 2 cruisers, numerous support vessels. I demand that you change your course 10 degrees, that is 10 degrees north, or countermeasures will be taken to ensure the safety of this ship. Canadians, this is a lighthouse, your call. Reality is what it is. No matter how powerful we like to think of ourselves being, we stand in danger of a terrible collision if we've got the wrong picture of what is in our mind. And so in Catholic theology, we're often going to hear truth described as being objective. And this means 2 things. One, the one that we're just talking about, that reality is separate from us, and us wishing it to be another way doesn't change it. But the second way that we mean that term, and I'm going to say equally as important, is the sense in which truth always remains objective. In the sense that, like when I'm teaching a class and I come up with a syllabus and I have course objectives, it means this is what we're striving for. So as Christians, we realize that reality is something that's very, very big. As one of my Dominican colleagues says, reality is like a bazillion bolts of electricity. And most of us are only working with like a 60-watt bulb in our brain. And even if you happen to be one of the lucky ones and you got a 100-watt bulb in your brain, the difference in the grand scheme of things is not all that great. So while in the Catholic tradition, we believe that there is such a thing as reality, and we believe that through our senses and through our God-given capacity for reason, we are able to perceive reality, we also recognize that there is more to the world, more to the universe than we will probably ever know. And so we have to be humble. Indeed, my understanding of a grain of corn or a star or a person or of God is so small in comparison to all that could be known about a grain of corn or a star or a person or about God, that in some ways, what I know, the picture I have in my brain is always like less accurate a picture than what could be. So truth always remains objective. It always remains something that we're striving for. It's not something that I could ever say that I possess. So one way that I think we could summarize the objectivity of truth from a Catholic perspective is to say that in Catholicism, there are no alternative facts. There will always be additional facts. So no alternative facts, but always could be additional facts. And maybe the model that we would lift up for ourselves as our patron saint in this area would be Bartimaeus. You probably remember this story from scripture. He's described as the blind man, the son of Timaeus, who cries out to Jesus, "Son of David, have pity on me." And remember how Jesus brings him over and asks him, "What do you want?" And Bartimaeus says, "Master, what I want is I want to see." And at one level, we could understand this at a very literal level, that Bartimaeus is asking for physical sight. But throughout all of history, the church has always read these stories also at a deeper, a symbolic level. And that is suggested here in the fact that this character in scripture is given the name Bartimaeus, which is interesting, comes from two words, bar, Hebrew, meaning son of, and Timaeus, which is actually a Greek name and not a Hebrew name at all. And we should know that in Greek, Timaeus is a very important character in Plato's dialogues. He is the one who in the dialogues speaks about wanting to understand all of the created world and all the elements that make up the universe. And in the dialogues, he describes sight as the beginning of knowledge. So what we are meeting here in Bartimaeus is really the son of Timaeus, and that the gospel writer probably wants us to understand that he is the son of Timaeus at this deeper level, that Bartimaeus is someone who's like us, who wants to have who has a deep and a persistent hunger to be able to see the world as it really is. And the promise that's offered in this story is that Jesus is someone who can help us to do that. For someone who's hungry and has a mind that's aligned with reality, for someone who's seeking truth, Jesus can work miracles for us. And in that sense, I think that Bartimaeus can be our very first patron saint of truthing. What we would say, though, is that when we're defining truth in this classical definition, the question we're asking is related to the nature of things, the existence of things. So what we're trying to find out is what is and what is not. So nothing in the universe half exists. Either you were born in the state of Indiana or you were not. Either the earth is 4.6 billion years old or it is not. So in common parlance, there's no way of being a little bit pregnant, right? Either you're pregnant or you're not. So doing truth at that most foundational level that I just talked about is about making sure that we have the best grasp of the world. We have the best grasp of what would widely be referred to as the facts. But the human mind does more than just simply collect facts, which often can be verified or rejected or refined on the basis of sensory observation and logic. The mind also not just collects facts, but that it uses these facts and organizes them in such a way that they make sense to us and to be able to figure out how to live best in the world. So, for example, if I said something like, "It's true that gambling is wrong," or if I said, "The fact of the matter is nobody should drive drunk," or if I said, "The fact of the matter is, as a matter of fact, we had plenty of kids to merit keeping the parish school open." So when I say stuff like that, what do you think? Are these facts? No. These are also truth claims, but these are truth claims of a different nature. So now we're talking about a second way in which we use the word truth in our everyday speech. And it's kind of tricky because in the middle of everyday conversation, we're using a lot of the same language. But these statements are not so much about whether something exists or not, or the nature of it or not, these statements are about whether something is good or bad, whether someone should or shouldn't, whether this option is better than that. And even though we label them as facts in our everyday speech, these are actually judgments, or what we would call opinions or conclusions or convictions that people hold as true. And when I say that something's an opinion or a judgment, it doesn't mean that it's not true, but rather that it's true or not in a different way. Let me say that one more time. I'm not saying that it's not true, but it's true or not in a different way. So we're talking about truth now as it pertains to meaning or decision making. And the fact that these get so easily conflated is one of the things that makes truth in everyday conversation in the world right now feel so hope and so stuck. But when we take a step back, recognize that we can make a critical distinction that while reality itself is objective, the person who's trying to make sense of reality, who's making judgments about what to do in reality, is always a unique individual, is a subject who has their own personal experience, a different family of origin, geography, where they live, a culture with its own native tongue, unique desires and feelings, different educational degrees, different capacities for reason that they've developed. And each of these factors plays a role in the way that the person comes to meaning and judgment of the world around them, which in some ways makes truth claims in this second category more difficult to adjudicate than truth claims in that first category. One way of helping us to think about this is a model that comes out of the business world called the Ladder of Inference that was devised by two professors on the East Coast who were trying to help think through how is it that a person arrives at a conclusion in the first place. And what they observe is that we all have a vast amount of data that's available to us at any one point in time, the facts that we could know, but without even being aware of it, our brain, because there's too many facts to pay attention to, too much to take into our body at any one point in time, our brain will automatically select the data that it considers to be the most important stuff to be paying attention to. And then from within the data that we consider to be important paying attention to, and this is given to us by our culture, by our faith tradition, by our educational system, by our family of origin, they'll all privilege certain information over other information. We will then add our own reasoning and interpretation to what we think that data means. So for example, let's say I go outside today and it's raining, but then the sun comes out. Some of us will be paying attention to the data on the ground because we're just going to be paying attention to not stepping in a puddle. Others of us will have selected the data of the sky to pay attention to, and we'll spot that there's a rainbow up there, where if I'm just paying attention to the ground, I won't even see the rainbow. But let's say I'm one of the people who selected the data of the sky. So I'm looking at the sky and I see this rainbow. And some of us who see the rainbow will say, wow, ain't that an interesting refraction of light particles or water particles against the light in the sky? And others of us come out of the Christian tradition. We've been coloring storybooks of the Bible since we were 4. We'll look at that rainbow and say, it's a sign from God. Like I'll see Noah, Ark, it's a sign I'm supposed to have hope. And at the end of the day, we come into home at the end of the day and we talk to our significant other, and one of us says, what a miserable day. And the other one says, it's all good. God is in charge. And you're like, were you in the same day? Were you on the same planet that I was on? But it's that we work up the ladder of inference to arrive at judgments based on different data, different reasoning, different interpretation. And then once we reach a conclusion, we will tend to pre-sort all the additional matter that comes into our system through where it is that we've already concluded. This is called confirmation bias. Now, when I'm saying this, I want to be really clear about the fact that I'm not saying that this means that all opinions are equal or acceptable, because from a Catholic point of view, we would say some judgments, some opinions are truer than others. They are better than others. So we don't have this sense of like, well, whatever goes. We don't espouse moral relativism any more than we would espouse factual relativism. But what this does mean is that we're going to need a different set of skills to be able to do truth in the arena of making judgments than in the arena of doing facts. So whereas in that first category, relying on sensory data, relying on logic and reason and science are all very helpful for doing truth in order to align one's mind with reality, we have to ask what would help us to, in the second category, do truth, which means aligning our mind with what's good. And for that, what's required is a God-given gift of conscience. That when we're trying to come to a good opinion or a good judgment, we need to begin with making sure that whatever we're going to make a judgment about is grounded in the facts. So for example, if I am trying to make a good judgment about what cancer treatment to pursue, I first want to make sure that whatever research that I'm going to base this judgment on, I want to make sure that it's good research, because if I'm not aligned with the facts, whatever cancer treatment I decide to pursue is not going to be as true as the one that would be grounded in the facts. But then I need to make sure that I am in the realm, and I have also an informed conscience. So I need to make sure that the data that I'm allowing to influence my thinking and my decision making is good data that's coming into my system, that it's ethical data that's coming into my system. And I'm obligated to think about what is the impact of my decision on other people. So I'm obligated not just to think about what would be good for me, but what serves the common good. And any decision that I arrive at, any judgment, any opinion that I have that hasn't considered not just what would be good for me, but the common good, from the Catholic perspective, is a less true opinion or judgment, conclusion, than it could be. The Bible story that I like to think of here, maybe our patron saint for this area, is the Syrophoenician mother, who again appears in the Gospels. In this story, we remember Jesus, by this point in time in the Gospels, he appears to have come to a really clear understanding that his vocation, his call to preach, is to the lost sheep of Israel, that his ministry is intended for his own people. But we know that he takes a little bit of time away to go to Sidon. Maybe he's trying to avoid the crowds, have a little bit of time of prayer and retreat for himself. And while he's there, a woman approaches him who's from Syrophoenicia. She's not one of his own people, but she comes and she asks Jesus to heal her daughter. And Jesus says, he's at the conclusion, no, my vocation is just to my own people here. And he actually says something possibly in good humor or possibly quite rude to her, and says, that the food can't be thrown to the dogs. And this woman comes back to him really quickly and says, yeah, but even the dogs get to eat the scraps from the table. And what she's doing here is she's expanding Jesus's view of what it is that he's called to do and who he's obligated toward. She widens his circle. And Jesus has an amazing moment in which, even as the Son of God, Jesus appears to have changed his mind. And he says, he praises her faith. He praises her comeback and realizes that his call is beyond service of just his own people. He is called to serve also her needs as well. It's a great exchange in which his ladder of inference is widened in this moment. A third way of thinking about truth. So if the first way that we've been talking about truth is having a mind that's aligned with reality, and a second way of talking about truth is having a mind that's aligned with what's good, a third way of talking about truth in the Catholic tradition is having a mouth that's aligned with your mind, so that what you say you think is real, or what you say you think is good, is really what you are thinking is real and good. And that's what the tradition calls truthfulness or veracity. So note that being truthful here doesn't necessarily mean that you're connected to reality. It is possible that you can be incredibly sincere and honest in sharing what is in your head, but that your head is not actually connected to reality. And in the Christian tradition, that's what's called error. And it's understood to be very unfortunate. It's also possible that your mind could be aligned with reality, but that what comes out of your mouth is totally different. And in the Christian tradition, that's what's called a lie. And that is understood to be a sin. So telling the truth is incredibly, incredibly important in the Christian tradition. And what we would hold is the reason why it's so important is because we believe that the functioning, indeed the survival of society, depends on society's minds being aligned with mouth. So you can't have a functional society if you can't trust that what other people is telling you is true. For example, you can't build a bridge or you can't build a building if the engineer won't tell you what they know about load-bearing structures. And you need to be able to trust that what the engineer is telling you is really connected with what the engineer knows. Now, you could get into a lot of nuance here. For example, is it ever okay to lie? And philosophers will go down this path. They'll ask and write long treatises on, like, if the Nazis are knocking at your door and they ask, are you hiding Jews? Do you have to tell them the truth? Or also they'll write a lot about, what about telling white lies? Like that, I think you look smashing in that outfit, even if I don't actually think that. Those are all great and interesting questions. And the Christian tradition has another set of practices regarding how much one should say and to whom. But I would say all of these practices revolve somewhat around the virtue of prudence. And this might sound really strange, but Thomas Aquinas says also around the virtue of justice. So in the Summa, Aquinas describes justice as giving each person what they're due. And so underneath justice, he describes truthfulness as giving each person the information that they're due, not more and not less. So for example, with the Nazis, are they really due the information about where Jews would be hiding? And so that would be like a space where one might be able to quibble. Is this information that that person is due? It still leaves a lot of room for discernment about what people are due, but I think what Aquinas has to say on the matter is a healthy start. What I think I would want to lift up as incredibly clear is what the Catechism of the Catholic Church says on this matter, that regardless of the Nazi at the door or the white lie, lying itself is regarded as sinful. And the Catechism is very strong on that point, says that it is the most direct offense against the truth, and that by its very nature, it is to be condemned. And that lying is not an issue that we are supposed to be neutral on, but something that we are supposed to call out and that we are supposed to insist upon truthfulness. A story that we might take in this category, a patron saint for ourselves in this area, is the Roman Centurion that Jesus meets. And remember, a Roman centurion is a very powerful man in Jesus's time. He would have been the general of a unit of the Roman army of 100 soldiers or more, sometimes up to 1,000 soldiers that he would have overseen. And being a military leader like that, he's someone whose word has a lot of power. If he says something, he knows that it will come to be. But what's most amazing is that this centurion approaches Jesus about his sick servant. And he says to Jesus, "You don't even need to come to my house. I know that your word alone has the power to heal my servant." Now, this is remarkable because Jesus is not someone who has military power or government power. But what he recognizes is that Jesus has the power of integrity, that his word and his action are so totally aligned that there's no deceit in Jesus at all, that his mind is aligned with reality and his mouth is aligned with his mind. And that degree of integrity allows miracles, allows healing to happen. And the centurion is someone who can see that in Jesus and respects that in Jesus. And I think is one of our very finest models in this area of truth, of doing truth. Finally, I want to add one fourth category for truth. And this is one that I don't think we can overlook. Though oftentimes it's not one that we would consider when thinking about truth from a philosophical or a Thomistic lens, but it's still extremely important from a biblical point of view, especially when we think about a Hebrew biblical point of view, our ancestors in the faith. I don't think a spirituality of truth can be complete without it. So remember in the beginning, I said that the Hebrew word for truth is the word emet. It appears in the Hebrew scriptures 127 times, and it's comprised of 3 Hebrew letters: Aleph, which is the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet, Mem, which is the middle letter in the Hebrew alphabet, and Tav, which is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And when you look at these 3 letters, all 3 of these letters have what are called 2 feet to stand upon. Emphasizes that 2 places that they're touching the line upon which they're written. And scholars of the Hebrew language emphasize that the very construction of the word says something about how our ancient ancestors in the faith thought about truth, that truth encompasses everything from the beginning all to the middle to the end. Truth is straightforward and comprehensible. Now, in contrast, the Hebrew word sheker, which is the Hebrew word for lie, this is also comprised of 3 letters. But in this case, all 3 of the letters come from the end of the alphabet, and their order is all jumbled up. So each letter in sheker only touches the line on which it's written once, as if it could easily be knocked over. But emet stands on 2 legs. So emet is well grounded, it's firm. And it's this last aspect of emet that makes it really difficult to translate into English adequately. Because yes, emet means much the same as what we use the word truth for in our everyday talk. It means grounded in reality, sound, honest, stable. But emet also has nuances beyond what we would hear. Emet is sturdy. Emet is trustworthy. Emet stands the test of time. So if you lean on emet, it will hold you up. Hence, in English, we find varying translations in the Bible of the same term. So depending on your Bible, in Psalm 119, it might say, "The sum of your word is truth," or it might say, Permanence is your word's chief trait. In Jeremiah chapter 7, some Bibles will say, truth has perished, and other Bibles will say, faithfulness has disappeared. And to the English-speaking ear, those sound quite different. But what it's hinting at is that truth is not just a way of thinking or speaking, but that truth is also, from our ancestors' way of thinking, a way of being in relationship. And we do have remnants of this still in our own language about marriage. So for example, if you were to ask me, is Mike true? I would be pretty sure that you were not asking in the first sense whether Mike exists or not, or whether Mike is a figment of my imagination. But because I've been married to Mike for over 25 years now, I would hear you asking, is Mike faithful? Can I count on Mike? And this understanding of truth is embedded in our vows. I promise to be true to you in sickness and in health, in good times and in bad, till death do us part. Now, I want you to know this is not the same thing as loyalty, which means sticking by somebody regardless of whatever it is that they do. It's about fidelity, which is wanting the other person to be their very best self, always wanting them to grow and to learn to be the person that God dreams them to be. And this characteristic of truth, which is so oftentimes lost in societal debates around truth, this has not been lost on Pope Francis. In his 2018 homily, he lifts up the Good Samaritan as a model for us in this category. And recall that this parable of the Good Samaritan, there's a man who is on his way back from Jerusalem. So we can guess probably Jewish, probably has just visited the temple. It's the number one reason why people would make a trip to Jerusalem. And on his way back, he's attacked and cast on the side of the road, beaten up, left for dead on the side of the road by robbers. And the first two people who pass by him, they do not stop and help him at all. In fact, it says they go to the other side of the road to pass him by. But then there's this man, not of his own people, who the scripture says draws near to him, doesn't cross to the other side of the road, but gets close to him. And when he gets close to him, can see the gravity of the situation and knows what to do without ever having studied the matter, like in an academic sense. In drawing close, he knows what to do. And this is what Francis talks about in his homily. He says we need to realize even more that closeness is the key to truth. Can distances really be shortened where truth is concerned? Yes, they can, because truth is not only the definition of situations and things from a certain distance, objectively speaking, discovered by abstract and logical reasoning. It's more than that. Truth is also fidelity. So for Pope Francis, truth is also about being there for people. And often it's only in being there for people versus analyzing situations objectively from a distance that we come to know better what really is real and what to do about it. So now, once again, we're talking about a totally different set of skills and virtues. They're going to be needed to embrace a spirituality of truth. So doing truth from this angle is going to involve practicing the art of overcoming fear and of difference so that we can grow closer to other people. It's going to be developing the capacity to remain in tough relationships, in tough conversations, but also developing healthy boundaries in relationships. It's going to mean figuring out when to stay and when to go. So let's sum up where we've been in this hour with each other. that there are 4 different dimensions to a spirituality of truth. And what we see is that God is present and heals those who long to see things as accurately as possible, are committed to figuring out what is real, but also those who form their opinions as carefully as possible, that speak as honestly as possible, and who try to be as faithful to one another as possible. That if we want to do truth, if we want to practice truth, all 4 of these are essential for coming to the light, as Jesus says. We can't just pick one of these. It's interesting because Hebrew language scholars are really quick to point out that emet is 1 letter away from the Hebrew word met, which means death. And we might wonder whether this is purely a quirk of the language or whether that in itself suggests a deeper insight. That the living of truth has a wholeness to it. We can't just pick one of these areas to be committed to and say, oh, I've embraced truth. You have to have all 4 there. All 4 letters of, all 4 areas of emet need to be there. Just saying, oh, I'm going to speak my mind, but not having a mind that's connected to reality is not practicing truth. Or being deeply committed to figuring out reality, but not caring about the impact that that has on other people and the impact that your decisions are having on other people, that does not count as practicing truth. If we remove even 1 letter from the word truth, we end up with death. And sometimes when people are watching the news, they keep asking that question, well, what does it mean to, like, what's it like to be living in a post-truth world? Or how do we navigate living in a post-truth world? In the end, from a Catholic perspective, we would say that is not the question to be asking. Because from a Catholic perspective, there's either a world in which we live truth, or there's not a world. There's no post-truth world. We either live truth or we die truth. But without truth, there is not a world. And I know that I, for one, would definitely prefer to recommit at this moment in time to living truth. And I'm excited to know that you are also sharing that commitment at this moment in time. So Erin, let
Yes,
me turn back over the screen, I guess, to you. And
absolutely.
any questions that have come in?
Yes, I'd like to invite those on with us right now to submit questions. Thank you so much, Anne. This is quite an interesting and thought-provoking reflection on truth. I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit as to kind of why you went down this road, why you have put this together. What might your hopes be for this, this
Yeah.
spirituality of truth?
I think in our national and our global situation right now, it's definitely something that's appearing on the news on a regular basis. I think it's something that's tearing people apart within their own families and the workplaces, definitely on social media. And I think a lot of people are asking the question right now, well, like, what is truth? Can we know truth? And there's just a glorious amount of stuff in our Catholic tradition that I think could help us at this moment in time that we are probably not widely familiar with and definitely not drawing upon as fulsomely as we could. Particularly as someone who works in the field of homiletics and preaching and teaching, I've just been interested to see how these questions get gummed up in the classroom when we try to talk about them with students, and also from the pulpit, how little we're speaking about this topic. We definitely speak, I've heard a good number of homilies, for example, condemning relativism, but not necessarily talking about the other areas of truth. Like I've not heard any homilies of late about the evils and the danger of lying. So like we tend to only talk about one area, and we're not really passing on, I think, in the preaching ministry, the fullness of our tradition around this. So it's something I've gotten more passionate about in recent years, and that it's been something I've felt in my own prayer life like I needed to deepen my commitment to at this moment in time.
Mhm. Thank you. Jackie says, this was wonderful, and I think it would be very helpful if we could use it as a beginning point when we teach around hard subjects like gender issues, is what she mentions.
Yeah. And so um, the book that's just hot off the press right now, Let's Talk About Truth, looks at all four of these different areas. The book that I worked on a little bit earlier on redeeming conflict is particularly talking about how to have conversations, I want to say, especially in that second category, when people of goodwill, all of whom are kind of dealing with the same facts, are still reaching different conclusions about what to do in a situation. For example, like how do we pastorally respond to students who self-identify gender-wise in a way that we don't understand or that would be perplexing to us. So it's like, how do we have conversations about this stuff? And how do we talk about like, okay, so this is the biological research that we're coming out of. This is the church tradition that we're coming out of. How do we talk about that? Like, how should we respond in the classroom to this? Like, how do we have that kind of conversation? And I think the stuff in redeeming conflict can be a helpful complementary um, to the stuff that we're talking about when we're talking about truth.
Great, thank you. Um, John said, are there hierarchies of truth insofar as natural categories are concerned? For instance, is scientific truth more important than those of the arts? How do you discern truths in the arts, especially when it's meant to be personally interpreted?
That's a great question. So and I should say first off, I don't have a PhD in philosophy. So just working on the book and doing this has been a huge stretching experience for myself. And I've learned all sorts of stuff, but in no way would say that I've mastered it. So there are a lot of, I think, tough questions that still have yet to be resolved. And maybe this is like the first volume on truth, but the second one is a lot of times the question around truth in art. So that's not something that we necessarily would speak of as an objective truth. It's not something that you're going to be able to go like measure and so forth. There are certain rules of aesthetics that we find kind of consistently appeal to people, but in general, that the realm of the arts is by nature subjective, and always going to be based on people's ladders of inference. And also, I think some of the big questions we are asking out there are things like, so in what sense is fiction true? Um, in what way it's like myth true? So those are the questions I didn't actually deal with at all when writing on this topic, but I think they're important and I think they're great next stage questions. Maybe I didn't. There definitely is a lot of stuff written on it, but maybe I was trying to look at the questions which I thought would be most helpful in helping people clarify their sticky conversations right now. But I find these kinds of questions also fascinating.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, Anne, thank you so much for sharing this time with us and definitely giving us a lot to think about that we can take to our, into our relationships and obviously our conversations with so many people in our own personal lives. So thank you. There is So much good to come from this discussion of truth, and we'd like you to continue that in your own reflections. So we'd like to offer you a discount on Let's Talk About Truth, 20% off, which brings the book down to $13.56, using webinar 0225 for today's date. And you can order at avemariapress.com. Please join us next week for a discussion of marriage. Certainly, these topics, I would imagine, go together in some way, truth and marriage. And as I mentioned before, this webinar is being recorded and a link will be sent to you tomorrow. So thank you again, Ann, and thank you everybody for supporting our webinar series. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.